Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. I am MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to discuss something I saw on Twitter, and I do want to just touch on this for a second. It is what they termed the heel problem, or black and white morality not being realistic. So let's go into a couple of tweets that I saw. So it was a conversation between a couple of reply guys, and one of them said WWE really has a heel problem, with so many being likable and justifiable. How do you expect us to root against them? There's very, very few I actually don't like. It's strange. And then one of the other reply guys said, that's not a problem. That's the point. Heels don't just do dastardly things without any reason anymore and cut you people promos. The world is not black and white, and neither should be the characters on our TV screen. And then another one said, I think that's the good part. Not everything is black and white in real life and in fiction. Having morally gray characters open up more room for writing different stories and getting to a point by different paths. I like it. So, morally gray characters. So what we're talking about here is essentially the heels of WWE right now, who are all essentially have the same story. That'd be Kevin Owens, Drew McIntyre, and Seth Rollins. Essentially, all of them have the same story. You worked with person X. I hate person X. Therefore, I'm going to fight you for working with person X. And it's not very entertaining because there's so many people doing it at one time. But let's talk about the morality of it. Well, here is one of the biggest problems here. Is that when people say that they want morally gray characters and they compare these things to, let's say, Thanos or Ultron from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, what you're doing is you're actually saying there should be characters that do evil things for reasons that I agree with. Meaning that there is evil that I agree with. So, that's deeply problematic. Here's the real thing here. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to be morally gray. I'm saying people can be morally gray for different reasons. In our current situation with Drew McIntyre and Kevin Owens especially, when you look at these two, their issue is, well, I was screwed over by Roman Reigns and all these people are turning and helping with Roman Reigns, and I should beat up the people who are helping out Roman Reigns. Okay, that's fine. In reality, however, what you're doing is you're listening to their justification for being a terrible person. And in reality, that's really all it is. See, some people, and I don't want to get too political on this subject, but one of the issues is that some people, these people being liberals, believe that all human beings are inherently good and are corrupted through some outside force, institutions, other people, circumstances, or whatever. This leads them to believe that a thief can be rehabilitated, a rapist can be rehabilitated, They believe that jail is for rehabilitation. While a lot of conservatives come from the very religious perspective of all human beings are morally flawed, and their moral flaws forces them to act in certain ways, and that they should be shaped by institutions to be better people. So what you'll often see is conservatives will believe in things like jail to punish behavior, not to correct behavior, but that people need to be removed from society because their behavior is acting negatively upon society. So when you look at the world from these two different perspectives, it's just two, right? You get very different outcomes. If you're looking at this thing from the perspective of Drew McIntyre is a naturally good man who is being corrupted by the bloodline, how many times he's been screwed by the bloodline, and then you say, well, Kevin Owens is a naturally good man who is been screwed by the bloodline, and his corruption is coming from being screwed by the bloodline. That then the storyline makes sense. If you say these guys are naturally good guys who are then pushed to the edge because of some great other evil. If you come from the other perspective, you'll say, well, Drew McIntyre did his own fair share of screwing. He screwed himself out of quite a few opportunities there. When he wasn't feuding with the Bloodline, he was picking fights with CM Punk. And remember, the last time he was a world champion, it was because he was mocking CM Punk that he ended up losing the belt in 5 minutes. And then you could say the same thing about Kevin Owens. Well, he lost that Saturday night's main event because he was the one who went outside the ring and grabbed the steel chair, which is illegal, and tried to use it, and it backfired and blew up in his face, Wile E. Coyote style. So from that perspective, you will say, how is this morally gray? You will see that a guy who is prideful and ambitious decided to taunt another man, and it blew up in his face. You will see another guy who was vindictive and violent, and that vindictiveness and that violentness blew up in his face. These are not naturally good positions. These are not naturally good people that are being corrupted by their circumstances. People sometimes are corrupted by their circumstances. Sometimes they are pushed to the edge due to negative behaviors. But then if you take a step back and you say, well, these two guys were corrupted by Roman Reigns. Okay. Who corrupted Roman Reigns? Because Roman Reigns has to be a naturally good guy too, who was flipped to the bad side for some other reason. Well, if you understand the storyline of Roman Reigns, you'll say that Roman Reigns was radicalized mostly by the audience. You know, the years of Roman Reigns trying to be a good guy, you know, the big dog, trying to be the hero, but getting booed out of the building, being rejected, being told to F off. And it's odd now that I'm seeing on social media how many people are reminiscing on the big dog Roman Reigns from like 2015, 2016, when he was out there actually trying to work hard in wrestling matches. And now he doesn't really seem to work that hard. And they're like, oh, I miss when the big dog, we used to go out there and work. It's like, yeah, you told him to F off and you said he wasn't good and you said he sucked. So he stopped doing all of those things. But ultimately, the idea that the heels don't cut you people promos anymore. Well, if you go back far enough, the problem is the people. The problem is that the people made Roman Reigns who he is, and thus he went on this streak of negative behaviors that affected other people's lives. Now, does that mean, let's say, that everybody who is similarly affected by Roman Reigns should have the same reaction? Why isn't Finn Balor angry about he was screwed by Roman Reigns? He was screwed by the Bloodline. They jumped him just as much as they jumped Drew. They jumped him about as much as they jumped Kevin Owens. Now, not for a long period of time, obviously, but he doesn't seem to be that upset about it. It seemed to have gotten over it, actually, and started looking for some other way of becoming a world champion and becoming a top guy. So what we see here is that, are these characters morally gray, or are these characters looking for justifications for their negative behaviors? And in our society, we go back to our blueprint that we started earlier, the liberal and conservative side of the aisle. When you look at the world from a liberal perspective, you are a good person and you are in a bad situation, in a bad circumstance, and you are corrupted by this circumstance. So let's take something small like theft. Stealing happens because you don't have money. Stealing happens because you can't afford regular goods and services, food, clothing, shelter, etc. Therefore, if you steal it, that can be seen as being a circumstantial situation. And thus, it can be excused or at least justified. And that's ultimately where they're trying to get to, is trying to justify negative behaviors, which is what we started with here. The fans who were tweeting were trying to justify the behaviors of these wrestlers that they like. You like Kevin Owens and you like Drew McIntyre, so you're looking for some kind of justification for their behavior. And once you justify and or excuse their behavior, then you can look the other way on the behavior. you can blame somebody else. And this comes to shifting of the blame. The blame does not fall on Drew McIntyre or Kevin Owens. The blame falls on Roman Reigns. The blame falls on the fans. The blame falls on the babyface. It's somebody else's fault. And then you, of course, once you get to that point, you can't have rehabilitation because the person has refused to accept responsibility for their own behavior. So the goal of liberal, let's say, criminal justice is to rehabilitate. But you can't rehabilitate people if they don't accept responsibility and realize that their negative behaviors come with negative outcomes. So let's take it from the conservative perspective, that all human beings are naturally flawed, and thus all corrective behaviors are forms of punishment. So if you take from the perspective that Drew McIntyre and Kevin Owens are naturally flawed characters, that they are already teetering on being ambitious and being violent, then you see their behavior over the course of the last several months or a year, etc., as being just, this is what they do. They don't know how to respond to stimuli or situations that they find themselves in without being corrupted. Therefore, they need to be punished. So this is where you start saying the babyface need to step up and lay down the hammer. This is where, Cody Rhodes should step up and kick the shit out of Kevin Owens, or, somebody else needs to stand up and kick the shit out of Drew McIntyre. And kicking the shit out of them will hopefully correct them, and their behaviors won't be so negative in the future. Now, of course, the typical heel is the ass kicking doesn't correct their behavior. In fact, it just forces them to shift their attention somewhere else, which is something else that you see from criminal justice, if you actually look, is that putting police officers near where criminals are, it doesn't really change their behavior as much as it diverts their behavior. So I'll give you a good idea of this. Drew McIntyre, his negative behaviors were aimed at CM Punk for whatever reason. And once he couldn't successfully kick CM Punk's ass, he lost the Hell in a Cell match, he diverted his behaviors towards Sami Zayn and Jey Uso, because the cost of attacking CM Punk was too high. He got his ass kicked. So instead of continuing to attack CM Punk, he decided, I'm just going to divert my negative behaviors towards somewhere where I won't get my ass kicked, which is Jey Uso and Sami Zayn. And Kevin Owens is similar. Once he gets his ass kicked by Cody, he will eventually divert his behaviors back to Randy Orton, where he has a certain level of success because he was able to power drive Randy Orton and put him out of action for a while. And that's pretty much how negative behaviors work, is negative behaviors operate until they don't, until you get some kind of negative stimulus that changes that behavior. And if the negative stimulus is hard enough, then you decide not to engage in that behavior anymore. Much like touching a hot iron, once you get burned, you realize it's not the good thing to do. And criminals, our villains or heels, operate the exact same way. If you make the cost of doing the negative behavior really high, then you can negate and divert that behavior. Now, in reality, there is not much in the way of grand justifications or grand excuses for negative behaviors, considering most people have the same issue, the same stimulus. I used Finn Balor as an example earlier, but the justification for Drew McIntyre and for Kevin Owens to engage in the negative behaviors that they engage in is that they were screwed by the bloodline, namely Roman Reigns. Well, Finn Balor was also screwed by the bloodline, namely Roman Reigns, but he didn't have the same outcomes that these guys have had. He hasn't had the same crash out that these guys have had. So to go back to our blueprint, if stealing is okay because you're poor, why doesn't more poor people steal? Very few people actually steal, whether rich or poor. And if poor people steal because they're poor, why do rich people steal? Because they're evil, right? But the principle should be taking things that do not belong to you is evil. That should be the principle. When that's not your principle, then you're looking for justifications, you're looking for excuses for these negative behaviors. But what that tells you is that human beings are not corrupted by circumstances or people, that it comes from a corrupt position, being a fallen person. This is why not all poor people steal. This is why sometimes rich people are the ones who are doing the stealing, because the person themselves is already flawed. The person themselves are already negative. They're already a villain. This is something that you get from a simple understanding that evil is banal. It is not some great justification for great acts of evil. What happens is people look for excuses. And then once they want to do the behavior, they'll even prime the subject to make you think that the behavior is positive. Or what they'll do is they'll have some kind of post hoc justification. A good example of this would be the tiny little mustache man spending decades telling people that the Jews were the problem. And then so when you decide to handle the problem, people are already primed to realize that the Jews are the problem. Or the green hat man, let's say, who shot a healthcare CEO in the back. You shoot the healthcare CEO in the back, kill him, and then you say, well, I did it because healthcare costs are too high. And people are like, yay, I understand that justification. And both of those things are quite evil, if we're being honest. And there is no justification for it. There might be a explanation, but there is no justification. There is no excuse. But what you end up having is people who sympathize with these evil people because they say, well, I would do the same thing if I was in that situation. Or I understand why you would do. And people always conflate understanding with agreeing. Like, if I understand you, that does not mean I agree with you. I understand why Kevin Owens is doing what he's doing. I understand why Hitler blamed the Jews for everything in World War II. I understand why you would shoot a CEO of a company if you don't like what the company does. I understand that. That doesn't mean that it's going to, one, solve the problem, because just because you have decided this is the problem, that your fix for the problem is going to be the right fix. You're also might be targeting the wrong unit of measurement. So if you have a situation like the healthcare industry, shooting a CEO is not going to change that, right? So if you have a problem with the bloodline, attacking Sami Zayn is not going to change your problem with the bloodline. If you have a problem with the bloodline, attacking Cody Rhodes is not going to change your problem with the bloodline. Your problem is with Roman Reigns. You should be attacking Roman Reigns. But this is pro wrestling. And these are storylines. These are not real life events. These are fictional events, and the stakes are a lot lower than, the mass murder of Jews or a father being shot dead in the street. But the justifications are the same, and the reactions are the same. Some people decide to cheer on evil because they quote unquote understand why the evil is doing what they do. But just because you understand it doesn't mean you should be agreeing with it, and it certainly doesn't mean you should like it. Now, as an adult, of course, these justifications, these morally gray positions, are things that people enjoy. They like them in their TV shows like The Wire, Power, Sons of Anarchy, etc., where you tell a story from the position of the bad guy, the drug dealer, the rapist, the murderer. And the position of the actual good guy is either non-existent, or the who should be in the position of the good guy is just as corrupt as the bad guy. So often you'll see in these places that the police, who are supposed to be the good guys, are often just as corrupt as the biker gangs and the drug dealers and the murderers, etc. And this sort of can work, and we've seen that these things have great deals of success. But there is a greater deal of success in media in which the good guys and bad guys, the morality play, the drama, is as clear-cut as possible. The villain is selfish. The villain is ambitious. The villain is evil. And the bad guys, they might not need to be, pure, but they're better off than the bad guys are. And that sort of thing can tell better stories. You learn more about the world in that kind of story. You can learn more about the person in these highly individualized, this is my justification for my behavior style stories. But then there is the grand narrative, which are these archetypes of people and what these people represent. And, somebody like Edge, which is an archetypal villain in the 2010s WWF. He was the standard archetype of the social climber, the highly ambitious, morally, I guess you could say, gray villain. He was very much a mustache twirling, how could I scheme to get on top or stay on top today kind of villain. Well, you don't really have these kinds of heels anymore, thanks to Triple H. But these characters tell larger stories. That Edge didn't want anything that everybody else didn't want, but it was how he went about it that made him the ultimate opportunist. They made him a scumbag. And then if you take another archetype, which would be John Cena, a guy who believes in hard work and dedication, and that the best way to get to the top is by busting your ass and making the most of every opportunity you have, not stealing, not cheating, not lying necessarily. Then you have a moral story that you could play between these two characters that tell a larger truth, a larger understanding of how the world operates. The cheaters, the liars, and the manipulators versus those people who believe in honesty and hard work. And you have a clash between those two groups. And each one has their own representative. You don't necessarily have that anymore. And people think that that's fine, which sometimes, the business is big enough to have those sorts of dichotomies where you have people who are, circumstantially the villain versus people who operate on some kind of grand narrative. But all in all, I think this whole subject is broached because people think that there should not be a such thing as heels and baby faces, that everything should be morally gray, and then you pick who you like in the story, who you agree with. And that's not the appropriate way to tell a story. You don't tell a story by having baby faces and heels engage in the same behaviors, having the same foibles, the same flaws, and operating in the same way. Because then nobody learns anything and nobody gets anything out of it. And the storyline gets boring. Stories are meant to tell stories. They're meant to reveal truth. And the truth of the matter is, you think there are justifications for negative behaviors. You think there are good excuses to do negative things. The problem is, there isn't, and there rarely ever is. But we're operating within the cell of the story. And in the story, sometimes people have to behave irrationally. In fact, that's how the world works. People are faced with completely normal and rational stimulus that should piss them off, that should make them angry. And in fiction, they have an exaggerated response. So you have somebody in a situation where in real life, if you saw somebody being friends with somebody that you dislike, you would also not be friends with them. The friend of my enemy is my enemy would be a fairly decent way to behave in the real world. But in pro wrestling, because it's fiction, you have to have an exaggerated response, which is, I'm going to attack the friend of my enemy, even if that person is not my enemy. An ally to my enemy is my enemy. And that's really where fiction can actually teach you something, is that these things are still villainous behaviors. But it also tells you a lot about how people view heroes. And I would close this video out by saying despite the fact that I've been talking about villains the entire time. This whole thing is about heroes. And what I mean by that is, if you actually liked the heroes, you wouldn't be justifying the villain's behavior, because it only works as a clear justification if you don't feel strongly enough about the good guys. If you think that stealing from a store is positive, it's probably because you don't care about stores. You don't care about the people who own stores. To use the example of the healthcare CEO who was shot in the back, you justify that behavior because you don't like healthcare companies. It has nothing to do with the individual guy who got shot. It has nothing to do with the guy who was the shooter. It has everything to do with your feelings about healthcare as an industry. It has everything to do about you, how you feel about the victim and or the babyface in the story. In other words, the reason why these people are in justification with Kevin Owens and Drew McIntyre and Seth Rollins and all these guys is because they don't really care about the hero. They really are interested in why you want to destroy the hero. And in some cases, they believe that the hero should be destroyed. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.